Out of all of the speakers here, this one makes me a touch nervous when I get around him because I've never told you, Dr. Don Livingston, but I have followed your work since I was a teenager, which is a long time ago. Dr. Thomas Fleming, you, yourself. But yeah, I'm honored to do this. He's a retired professor of philosophy at Emory University. He's published 2 books on the philosophy of David Hume. He was twice a visiting fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Edinburgh. He founded the Abbeville Institute, dedicated to a study of what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. He is in the final stages of a philosophical study of the coming apart of America in 1861 to 1865 and the coming apart today. Dr. Don Livingston.
Thank you very much, Buck. Before we get started, I'd like to mention these 2 books published by the Abbeville Institute on Southern literature. We have another one out on Emmy Bradford's essays on Faulkner. This is on Faulkner as a Southerner, and this is on the classical origins of Southern literature. And what I'm going to talk about today is largely taken from this book. Prominent liberal philosopher Richard Rorty said approvingly, quote, "In a truly enlightened liberal society, no trace of divinity would remain," end quote. He might be right about New England. Once the most religious part of America is now the least. By Pew Research Center criteria, only 30 to 34% of the 6 New England states are judged highly religious, whereas 70 to 78% of 6 Southern states are highly religious. And of the 15 top highly religious states, all are in the South except for Utah and Iowa. Why is this? One reason I suggested at the first Ludwell Fellowship Conference last year is that the South, more than any other region, developed the lineaments of a traditional society, and this is something that Alphonse has just talked about. Traditional societies of all kinds are as inclined to divinity as Rorty's enlightened American liberalism is inclined away from it. But what philosophically is a traditional society? It is one that springs from a story a community has inherited that teaches what it ultimately means to be an excellent or good human being, what a proper relation is to divine order and to the members of the community, and it provides education into the practice of the virtues needed to achieve that excellence. That's basically what a traditional society is. Some of them are horrible and have horrible notions of human excellence, but they all are the same structurally. I shall take a stylized image. What I've just described is what Aristotle has said. I'll take a stylized image of Aristotle's political philosophy as the symbol of a traditional political society, and the 17th century English philosopher Thomas Hobbes as the symbol of the modern state in his book, Leviathan, 1651. Now, the modern state had been percolating since the late Middle Ages through monarchies, but Hobbes is philosophically the father of the modern state and the father of liberalism because he articulated it more clearly than anyone had. Hobbes and Aristotle, then, are the subatomic physics of 2 ways of thinking about human beings and political order. There are many forms of liberalism and many forms of traditional society, but we're talking about the subatomic physics of those structures. Hobbes and modernity and basic liberalism has no use for Aristotle. Hobbes writes, quote, "I believe that scarce anything can be more repugnant to government than much of what Aristotle hath said in his Politics, a book, nor more ignorantly than a great part of his Nicomachean Ethics." That sets the stage for the incommensurability between these two visions of the subatomic physics of political order. Now, the story I tell is that that 16th century Europe was an Aristotelian-style civilization, broadly conceived, cast in the idiom of Christian virtue, despite the quarrel between Catholics and Protestants. The idea of the Hobbesian modern state, which, as we shall see, is identical to the first liberalism, appeared a century later as a scandal in Europe. But through Puritan and other dissenting forms of Protestantism, it gradually gained a foothold in the English Civil War and advanced throughout Europe. A century later, with the French Revolution, or a little over a century later, Hobbesian liberty became the dominant idiom of a European state, France. The first English settlers to America arrived before the English Civil War and planted an Aristotelian idiom in the colonies on the eastern seaboard, which prevailed until the Civil War, after which America came to emulate what was now a Europe of would-be modern Hobbesian states. I say would-be because, as Rorty himself recognizes, no actual liberal regime is truly enlightened. If they were, they would be atheistic. There have been many liberalisms, but all to some degree contain within their borders survivals of Aristotelian dispositions left over from what was once a European Christian civilization. So the modern state is an eruption that appears in the 17th century. It's only a little over 4 centuries old. And it's unique. There had never been anything like the modern state. There are things that look like it, like empires and so on, but they're different. So this Aristotelianism survives because it's based on Greek, Roman, and Christian civilization. You don't just do away with that. Now, what makes the South exceptional in respect to religion, and much else besides, is that since its birth at Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, over 4 centuries ago, it flourished as an Aristotelian-style polity up to the Civil War, after which it began a slow drift into the idiom of Hobbesian liberty. The main point of this essay, is to suggest that what sustained the South's character as a tradition-centered Aristotelian-style society is that for 3 centuries, roughly from 1607 to 1909, study of the Greek and Roman classics in the original languages was an essential part of Southern education. And that was unique. I now turn to a closer look at the quarrel between Aristotle and Hobbes. The essential difference is that Aristotle thinks political society is natural to man and exists for the fulfillment of his nature, an essential part of which is a proper orientation to divinity, that is to say, the ultimate mystery of being. For Hobbes, however, Hobbes is a thoroughgoing materialist. Materialism was the the default position for science in the 17th century, Galileo, Bacon, and so on. For him, there are no Aristotelian natures in man or anything else. The excellences of which may unfold in the course of the history of things doesn't exist. They're simply blind matter in motion. Man is motivated for Hobbes only by self-interest, and he's diffident of others unless it's in his interest to be otherwise. And as in Galileo's principle of inertia, an individual, for him, moves in a straight line of power and glory unless acted upon by an outside force. That's our condition. Now, since everyone acts this way, that would be intolerable. It would have anarchy and the constant fear of a sudden and violent death. You can never go to sleep in peace. So out of enlightened self-interest alone, men agree, or a group of people in a territory agree to transfer all the liberty they had under anarchy to a conqueror, to a ruler, usually a conqueror, to rule over them for the sake of a degree of peace and civil association. So Hobbes is the father both of the modern state and of modern liberalism. This is kind of a primitive form of liberalism. They're more sophisticated forms, but at the core of every sophisticated liberalism is this primitive liberalism. The liberal regime contains no discourse about human excellence and the virtues. It's based on nothing but mutual fear and enlightened self-interest of the ruler and the ruled. And there is no trace of divinity in it. So there's a sense in which Rorty's truly enlightened liberalism is the first liberalism, which is that of Hobbes. That is to say, it's the first in idea, not in the world, because when liberalism was announced, it was a scandal. An unenlightened liberalism would be one in which there was a high degree of Aristotelian dispositions in it. That would be a liberalism that was not terribly enlightened. It would be unenlightened. And so this liberalism is a sort of this Aristotelianism is an undigested thing in the bowels of a liberal state that must be tolerated and, if possible, gradually eliminated. By the 1830s, that role would be played by the American South in what was increasingly becoming a would-be Hobbesian liberalism. This break requires some explanation because until the 1830s, America was overwhelmingly Aristotelian in its political dispositions. The Eastern Seaboard was simply an order of small Protestant communities. The largest city was Philadelphia with only 30,000 people in 1776. To understand this break, we need to look at the substantial cultural differences that existed between the two first substantial regional cultures, the colonies of Virginia and New England. Now, the Puritans arrived in New England in 1620, and those that followed them came on a mission to found a purified, highly regimented form of Protestantism. But the earlier colonists settled in Virginia in 1607 did not come with the idea of purifying anything. They came to secure land on which to emulate a way of life they had known in England, inspired in part by Italian Baldassare Castiglione in his book, The Book of the Courtier, from which was constructed the ideal of an English Christian Renaissance man. So these were Elizabethans that hit the coast of Virginia in 1607. They were born under Queen Elizabeth. And she was not modern. This English Renaissance man had to be proficient in athletics, military exercises, reading and writing Greek and Latin, and being able to write poetry in it, and in the arts such as drawing, music, and architecture, and other things. So this was very much a tradition-centered Aristotelian society, or would-be society. Now, Richard Weaver opens a window into the different types of character produced by the regional cultures of New England and Virginia by comparing the diaries of Cotton Mather, Cotton Mather, both in the 17th century, a Puritan minister of Massachusetts, and William Byrd of Virginia, a planter, lawyer, and member of the governor's council. Both were men of letters, members of the Royal Society in London. They had visits to London, and leaders in their communities, yet their characters are worlds apart. And this suggests that their cultures were worlds apart. Weaver found a Gnostic strain running throughout Mather's diary regarding nature and society. Nature does not appear as a reality with its own telos, to be studied with awe and wonder, much less an instrument for conveying God's grace. It is part of an utterly fallen world, the realm of the demons, to be used by man as he pleases. And he's to rise above it. Likewise, society is not experienced as the natural good of conviviality among flesh and blood human beings, but through a Calvinist ideology of the dynamic between the elect, chosen by God, and those who are damned. There's no trace of Gnosticism in William Byrd's diary. He embraces participation in nature through the grace of God, is grateful for its beauty and goodness, but has a prudent regard for its awesome power to destroy. He is aware of evil in society, but is not obsessed with perfection. He is flexible and tolerant in judging others. He accepts the Church of England's theology of sin and redemption, prays daily, gives thanks, and confesses his sins, especially his weakness for women. Byrd was not a cleric or a scholar, a man of affairs, but he thought a Christian gentleman should know the original languages of his religion. So his daily practice was to read in those languages before breakfast. For example, one entry reads, arose at 6 a.m., read before breakfast, 2 chapters in Hebrew, and some Greek in Lucian, end quote. Byrd was very much a well-rounded English Renaissance man in the frontier region of Virginia. This Virginia culture gave rise to many such men, Jefferson being one of them. And you've got to realize there were many others, Madison, Monroe, others. Jefferson could read and speak 6 languages, was an accomplished violinist, was proficient in economics, philosophy, and religion, mathematics, horticulture, and architecture. For the first 36 years of the United States, there were only Virginia presidents, except for John Adams' single and only term as president. For 36 years, why were these Virginians put in high office? Why did the people in Boston, New York, and all put them in office? I might also add that Robert E. Lee could give the Greek exam at Washington College after the war. The 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume said, Puritanism is more a system of metaphysics than a religion, because it has no sacramental character. And David Hume predicted that it would become increasingly secular. Even in his own time, it was becoming so in the 18th century. By the end of the 18th century, the religious flame of Puritanism was dying out in favor of more secular forms of Protestantism, including Unitarianism. But the tradition-free Gnostic disposition inherited from the Puritans remained as a character of New England intellectuals. It still remains. I remember I was asked to give a talk at Williams College in Vermont, and on the way, I was in a rental car and I turned on the radio. I happened to hit NPR, and a voice appeared saying, "Welcome to New Hampshire Public Radio, coming to you from New England, where people get together when they want to change the world." Imagine writing, "Welcome to Georgia Public Radio, coming to you from Georgia, where people..." There's still a difference. Cultures, when planted, are hardy plants and don't easily change. An example of this Gnostic disposition among some of the New England writers, not all, of course, one of them was Noah Webster, famous for his dictionary, but few know of his world-inverting Gnostic disposition. He was an unrepentant supporter of the French Revolution, even its reign of terror. This disposition appears in his dissertation on the English language, 1789, which sought to revolutionize English by purging all traces of tradition to make it rational. Literary critic Adam C. Wolfe thought this work made, quote, "truly horrifying reading," end quote, and was suggestive of George Orwell's 1984. This is 1789. That was the year of the French Revolution. Webster also sought to promote eliminating the classics from education, and he influenced Yale against the classics. Basil Gildersleeve of Charleston, South Carolina, ranked by scholars as the finest classicist in 19th century America, said Harvard was responsible for derailing the classics in academia. Along with this purge of tradition from the English language and of classics from education, there was a profusion of neo-Puritan secular ideologies, one of which was Ralph Waldo Emerson's transcendentalism. Inspired by German idealism, it favored an autonomous individual, tradition-free, who had transcended the authority of tradition and social convention, in favor of the individual's subjective feelings and his own creative will. Emerson was the mentor of Walt Whitman. Literary scholar James Kibler interprets Whitman's famous poem, Song of Myself, as a manifesto of a new American individualism, destined for the new American Eden, with his own poetry as the new Bible and himself as the new Christ leading us to it. In the poem, he sings a song of himself, where he has occasion to celebrate his genitalia and sing that, quote, "the scent of these armpits is aroma sweeter than any prayer," end quote. This is an early instance in America of that militant, expressive individualism we are familiar with today, such as the plethora of gender identities, each of which has a set of pronouns its proponents are eager to impose on the public, by law if possible, along with same-sex marriage and the Gnostic ideology of transgenderism. While New England cultural elites led the way in celebrating the adventures of the autonomous individual freed from the encumbrances of tradition, Southerners were cultivating an Aristotelian-style society rooted in a tradition-centered form of moral and political rationality. Tradition is critical, it's self-critical. Not all are. So, some traditions have very little self-criticism. But when they do, they develop a philosophy of self-criticism, but it's rooted in tradition. Listen to what Jefferson says of this education. Central to this Southern view was immersion in the Greek and Roman classics in the original language. Quote from Jefferson, "I enjoy Homer in his own language infinitely beyond Alexander Pope's translation. And I thank on my knees him who directed my early education for having put into my possession this rich source of delight, end quote. Very grateful that he went through the rigors of learning Greek so that he could actually think in it, enjoy it. Southerners read the classics as critically for the moral and political wisdom they contain, which was filtered through Christian revelation. That is to say, some of the heroes of the Greek classics, they read right along with the saints. The ancient Greeks and Romans, after all, were the inventors of democratic and republican self-government, and Southerners identified with their hatred of monarchy and large centralized states. These Southerners emulated the ancient republican heroes and their selfless dedication to republican virtue, such as Cicero, Cincinnatus, and Cicero. I mean, Washington was Cincinnatus. He was identified that way. This gave them immunity to Hobbesian centralization and the siren call of Hobbesian liberty. That the North could dismiss or disparage the classics as essential to humane learning created a deep cultural wedge between the regions. And it deepened with each move the North made in the direction of Hobbesian liberalism. Massachusetts in 1836 led the way in providing universal secondary education at the state's expense, a system initiated by Horace Mann and so on. Southerners were opposed to this because they thought education of children should be up to the home, the church, and the local communities, not state bureaucrats. But they had nothing against state universities at the higher level. In fact, the South led the way. The North had no state universities until after the Civil War. The first state chartered university was Georgia, 1785, followed by North Carolina, 1789. University of Tennessee was first called Bloch College, 1794. South Carolina, first called the College of South Carolina, was 1801, Virginia 1819, Alabama 1831. The first college in the world chartered to give women advanced degrees was Wesleyan College in Macon, Georgia, 1836. The early northern universities were private and were formed initially to educate Calvinist ministers. Southern universities had a broader range of literature, including a substantial holding in the classics. Literary historian James Kibler observes that the University of South Carolina in 1850 had more non-theological books than any college in America, including Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Jefferson sardonically called these universities, quote, the northern seminaries, end quote. Seminaries, not universities. So he founded the University of Virginia to counter that, to provide a more humane kind of education. Though Southerners rejected Massachusetts' system of education for children, based on the Prussian model, by the way, those private schools and community schools served the purpose of educating students for college quite nicely, because Frank L. Owsley, historian Frank L. Owsley, observes that as of 1860, this quote, the South had more college-educated men and women in proportion to white population than the North or any other part of the world, end quote. There was one college student for every 247 white inhabitants in the South, but only one for every 703 in the North. So one for every 247, one for every 703, nearly 3 times. The wealthy sent their sons to elite schools in Britain, Eton, Oxford, and the Middle Temple. Of the 350 Americans admitted to the Inns of Court in London before 1860, nearly 2/3 were from the South. Northern schools such as Yale and Harvard had large contingents of Southerners. Calhoun was elected valedictorian for his class at Yale. His name is stricken from a building today. Nearly half the students at Princeton in 1850 came from the South. Although representing half the total number of colleges, the 260 colleges in the South represented half the total of the United States, half. Many were small, but according to William Dodd, in the decade between 1850 and 1860, practically every Southern college and university doubled in attendance. It was right up before the war. Now, what was the preparation like for Southern students entering higher education? A window is opened in a letter wrote in August 1785 by Thomas Jefferson to his nephew, Peter Carr, planning a system of study to get him into college. He was to begin by studying ancient Greek history, using an English version at first. Then he was to read Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon's Hellenica, and Anabasis, Quintus, Curtius, and Justin. Jefferson stresses that young Peter should read in the original languages, which means that prior to college, he already had a reading knowledge of Greek and Latin. Next was Roman history and modern history. And Jefferson continues, quote, in Greek and Latin poetry, you have read or will read at school Virgil, Terence, Horace, Anacreon, Theocritus, Homer. Read also Milton's Paradise Lost, Ossian's poems, Pope's works, and Swift's works to work out your own English style. In morality, read Epictetus, Xenophon's Memorabilia, Plato's Socratic Dialogues, and Cicero's Philosophies. Of course, he assumes he's reading the Bible too. He then but not for college, he then insists on an hour or two of physical exercise. What hours are left after exercise, he divides into three parts. Quote, give the principal to history. The other two, which should be shorter, to philosophy and poetry. Peter is to write once a month or two to let Jefferson know of his progress, to get criticism. Now, Jefferson informs him that the following books are to be sent from London in the care of James Madison. They include Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon's Hellenics, Anabasis and Memorabilia, Cicero's works, Baretti's Spanish and English dictionary, Martin's Philosophical Grammar, and Martin's Philosophica Britannica. And from Paris, Jefferson himself will send Bizot's Mathematics, de Lalonde's Astronomy, Muschenbroek's Physics, Quantus Curritus, and Justin. These books, he says, are not to be opened until you enter the university because they're all in French. And he adds, you are now, I expect, learning French. I mean, along with Greek and Latin. You must push this because the books, when you advance into mathematics, natural philosophy, and natural history, will all be mostly French. These sciences being treated by the French writers better than the English. Our future connection with Spain renders that the most necessary of the modern languages after the French. When you become a public man, you may have occasion for it, end quote. Dear Peter, yours affectionately, T. Jefferson. Now, a half century after this letter, students entering the University of South Carolina in 1839 were to have already read in the original the whole of Virgil's Aeneid, Cicero's orations, Xenophon's Cyropaedia, Sallust, and the Gospel of St. John. The sophomore year included, among other things, Horace and Homer's Iliad. One student recalled the following schedule, quote, Monday and Tuesday, recitations in Latin and Greek. Before breakfast, remember Byrd reading Hebrew and Greek before breakfast? Every Wednesday and Thursday, we recite Cicero, and the other days of the week, Homer. end quote. The Civil War and Reconstruction were designed, whether intentionally or not, to shape the South into the image of Yankee industrial society. Since the classics were read as an end in themselves and to the end of informing a good and noble character, they served no purpose in a world shaped by industrial society. It had other needs. Yet here and there, the high antebellum Southern standards survived. In 1895, Tennessee erected a full-scale replica of the Parthenon, the only one in the world, in Nashville to celebrate its centennial as a state and as an act in tribute to its classical heritage and identity. This was over the decades. The building, the Parthenon, underwent reconstruction with materials to make it permanent and to finish off exact replicas of its decorations. And in 1990, a long-awaited 47-foot scale replica of Athena, covered in gold, was placed in the temple. That's the largest standing statue in a building in the world, I've been told. I don't know. That's pretty impressive. I wonder if any converts are going to that temple. In 1900, only 5 years after this new Parthenon was erected, Vanderbilt University, standing nearby in Nashville, still required the stiff classical requirements that Jefferson laid out for Peter Carr in 1785. This was after the classics were diminishing in the South after the war. To enter Vanderbilt, a freshman had to have had 4 years of Latin and 3 of Greek. Even an English major had to take 2 additional years of Greek and Latin on top of that to graduate. By 1909, those requirements had weakened, as they would everywhere after World War I, and even more rapidly after World War II. The great poet T.S. Eliot told Southern poet Ellen Tate, who had graduated from Vanderbilt in 1922, quote, "You may not have had a very large curriculum in the Southern colleges, but it was sound because you had Latin and Greek. At Harvard, the curriculum had been ruined." Eliot was there, graduated in 1909. It was ruined. And Eliot confessed, quote, "I never got any education until I graduated from Harvard because it was like a cafeteria. You just took one little thing after another, whatever you wanted." This is like the Hobbesian state, which has no goal, no purpose, just individual autonomous liberty within the restraints of the sovereign power. Can't violate that, of course. Now, what is the meaning? This is near the end. Not the end, but near the end. What is the meaning and legacy of the South's 3-century-long devotion to the classics in education? Big topic. Here, there's time only for a few miscellaneous observations that might prove interesting. First, an Aristotelian polity aims to cultivate an excellent human character, given its understanding of the human good. The kind of character the antebellum South, at its best, the kind of character the antebellum South handed down at its best from 2.5 centuries of exploring the Greek and Roman classics in the light of Christian revelation was commented on by Northerners and foreigners alike. I'll just mention one example. In The Mind of the South, W.J. Cash, 1941, described it. Now, we're talking about the antebellum South. We're not talking about the South today, necessarily. Described it as a world singularly polished and mellow, quote, "a world singularly polished and mellow and poised, wholly dominated by ideals of honor, chivalry, and noblesse," end quote. It exhibited, he said, and, quote, an immense kindliness and easiness. It embodied the classical Republican virtue, which you get from the classics, of restraining your liberty by the good of the family and society. These aristocratic virtues filtered down to the yeoman farmers and gave a tone of courtesy, hospitality, and ease to the region. Opposed to this was the North in the throes and chaos of the Industrial Revolution. No one knew what to do with this Industrial Revolution. It really was a revolution all over Europe. And so it was chaotic. It was ruled by a Hobbesian, now after 1865, it was ruled by a Hobbesian centralized state with plenary power over autonomous individuals, each pursuing his own power and glory and different of others, with no common vision of the human good. Historians acknowledge that making money at this time had become a religion in the North, blessed by the clergy as an instrument of human progress. Southerners, because of their classical training, for the most part, were immune to this. An example is Eugene Genovese, one of the great historians of the South, a tough Brooklyn guy, once a Marxist, a communist, but came very much to appreciate the South. Atlantic Monthly in the 90s called Genovese America's greatest living historian. I don't know who would say that today, but he certainly was the greatest historian of slavery. The South, he said, participated in an international capitalist world, but it was not of that world. The planters typically did not pour their profits into making more money. They poured those profits into consumption, improving their estates and workers, hospitality, and in social obligations of noblesse oblige in fairly tightly connected communities of kith and kin and friends. It was said at the time that Yankees know how to make money while Southerners know how to properly spend it. Richard Weaver said that the antebellum South was the last the last non-materialistic civilization in the West, end quote. Kenneth Stamp, one of the memorable Civil War historians and a Northerner, observed that the Yankees went to war preaching the best of capitalist ideals, but all they accomplished was, quote, the shoddy aristocracy of the North, the ragged children of the South, end quote. There were no victors, end quote. Now, the shoddy aristocracy was what historians call the Gilded Age, a long period of crony capitalism, plundering of the public purse, government corruption, and sham pretensions. It received a mordant criticism from thoughtful Northern writers. Three of these were prominent novelists: Henry Adams, Henry James, and Herman Melville. It is interesting that each of these chose as the instrument of their criticism of the Gilded Age a former Confederate who had moved north and whose character and manners displayed in the novels were a mute rebuke to the Gilded Age. Genovese observes two achievements of the antebellum South. First, it was the only section to develop a sophisticated native criticism of the evils of Hobbesian liberalism. Second, it was the first to work out a systematic criticism of the Hobbesian modern state. The first, not the only. There were later criticisms, but it was the first. And to explain how that state leads to totalitarianism, which would run wild in the 20th century. Among these critics was John C. Calhoun, who was the first American to work out an original political philosophy. It bears I taught philosophy a long time. I would say it compares favorably with the small number of modern classics. But it doesn't have the influence because it's based in Aristotelian presuppositions. And modern political philosophy is based in Hobbesian presuppositions. They have different subatomic physics, so to speak. Of Calhoun's disquisition on government, Lord Acton described it, quote, as the acme of political perfection. Third, and this is the last page, a few words about Southern literature. One of the great things the South has done, recognized worldwide, and classical education. Early on, Southerners were recognized for their skill in writing and eloquence. This is helped by reading Greek, knowing Greek and Latin. Literary historian Francis Butler Simpkins observes that, the devotion of Southern students to the classics and their participation in recitations and debates of the literary societies accounts to a large degree for the grace of manner, classical allusions, and flowing melody of the Old South's numerous orators, end quote. This grace is also exhibited, I would say, in diarists, letter writers, and novelists who inherited this classical education. It was for this reason, I think, that Jefferson was chosen to write the Declaration of Independence. They knew he was a wordsmith. James Kibler points out that in the late 19th century, some Northern critics started a positivist movement in writing called realism. Just as scientists, doctors, and engineers strip language of metaphor and other meanings to express facts, empirically discernible facts, a similar technique was developed for writing fiction. They were followed in the 20th century by Sherwood Anderson, Sinclair Lewis, and later by fellow Midwesterner Ernest Hemingway's minimalist prose. Have you ever read Hemingway? Anybody ever read Hemingway? You know, the cat is on the mat. John sat down. I mean, it's sort of like a doctor's report. I mean, it can be interesting. It has its own merit, but that's what it is. Kibler suggests this prose reflects the corporate world and the technocratic spirit of an industrial society. Aristotle, by contrast, said metaphor is the most profound but difficult art to master. Metaphor. And it's the one art that no one can teach. It's an act of genius, because the metaphor takes what's true and unites it with what is not factual, takes what's factual and unites it with what's not factual. So when you're thinking in a metaphor, you could think about the physical world in the light of God. But since you can't speak about God directly, you have to make a metaphor and twist out of the physical substance God, the grace of God. You only do that through metaphor. You can't do it through simple factual writing. Factual writing just keeps you covered, keeps a ceiling on life. It doesn't let it expand to the mystery of being. But even, and it's interesting that the South produced two geniuses in literature. I mean, really geniuses. Poe is one, and Faulkner is another. Faulkner, many scholars say, is America's best writer. And the reason is he was able to construct new literary devices. In other words, he had a mind that could just expand the scope of literary. So did Poe. Poe even invented genres like the detective novel, horror stories, and so on, and science fiction. Poe even developed the first bang theory. He did. No scientific evidence for it, but it shows the imagination. But even genius presupposes an education. Genius, nobody's born with genius. People are born, they can't even talk. They have to be educated. You can put a genius without an education, you got a problem. Antebellum students were required to write poetry in Greek and Latin, as well as master English literature. And this gave them an expansive literary imagination. The Greek mind, the Latin mind, the English mind are different minds. The world's reality is the same. If you can think through these three, you have great power as a writer. And the Southern literary tradition, influenced by classical education, still has that power, even though the young today don't usually have a classical education. That doesn't mean that the achievements of 3 centuries or so does not exist. Here's an example of that persistence. A Northern author and teacher of creative writing said the following, quote, about her students and the class. Often when a Southerner reads his work, the members of the class look at each other and you can hear them thinking, gee, I can't write like that. The power and force of the land is in the piece. You get that only through metaphor. The power and force of the land is in the piece. These Southerners know the names of what shrubs hang over what creek, what dogwood flowers bloom, what color, what kind of soil is under their feet. I tease the class. Pay no mind. It's just the Southern writing gene. The rest of us have to toil away, end quote. So she sees something that's just there, inherited. What she describes is not a gene, but the inheritance of a Christian culture enriched by the Greek and Roman classics, and in which all 3 resonate with the mystery of divinity. Thanks.